We have learned a great deal about the scale and complexity of the global energy transition, the integrity of energy in our lives, and the current foundation that fossil fuel plays in our economy so far. But the question that sticks in my head is, where are we going to get the money to pay for the energy transition? Even keeping up with our growing energy demand is a challenge.
There's lots of needs in the global economy, in addition to the energy transition. Some companies are in a recession or low growth environments. These challenges are going to need public funds as well, like the recent U.S. infrastructure bill, as well as private or market capital. I read where it'll take trillions per year for all the categories of all the economies to meet their decarbonization goals. I agree. I'd like to know where all this money is going to come from.
We are already spending a lot of money for the current energy economy based on fossil fuels. Another challenge is to keep the lights on and manufacturing plants on while building other and new energy infrastructures. I know that there are carbon taxes in some places, and I would like to know how much they work. The topic of climate finance isn't something I've thought much about, so I'm glad to see that we have Brad Handler from the Sustainable Finance Lab of the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines on the episode to help us better understand where the public and private investments are going to come from.
I agree. I need a better background on finance in general. But I'm also excited that we're going to talk to Staci Taruscio from Rebellion Energy Solutions to get an entrepreneur's perspective on putting together a new type of company to deal with carbon emissions from plugging orphan oil wells in a new market called the Voluntary Carbon Offset market. Some of the solutions to the energy transition must come from new business models, as well as the traditional banks and government regulations.
All right, well, hi, Stacy. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Future of Energy podcast.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll just jump right in. Can you introduce yourself? Give us a little personal and industry background and tell us what got you into the oil and gas industry.
Okay, great. So my name is Staci Taruscio. The personal side of it is I have a husband and I have two daughters, and you can see all of their art here in the background, if that gives you any indication of what we're like as a family, maybe. The professional side, let's see, I have a petroleum engineering degree and from the University of Tulsa, not USC, but I hear they're both pretty good. And I was in industry for several, decades, which is not great to admit. But working as a petroleum engineer, I worked mostly as a reservoir engineer, spent a lot of time in the field and doing some production stuff as well. But, just very traditional oil and gas exploration and production type things, had a great foundation there. Kind of went out and started my own company with some private equity backers in 2015. That was a great experience. I did several iterations of running those types of company, all under the name Rebellion. And then about almost 4 years ago now, we consolidated our last company with in the Powder River Basin. And all the core group of us sort of looked around and said, what do we want to do now? And it was in a very reflective time, I think, for most of us in the US. It was COVID, it was energy transition, it was a lot of those conversations beginning to really get hot and heavy. And so our core team sort of said, we want to take our oil and gas expertise, right? And we want to apply it in a really positive way to those types of conversations. And so how do we do what we know how to do in a way that adds to the conversation? And so that marriage between like industry and environment, or industry and social justice kind of matters, became really important for us. And we looked for where do those things overlap, and where we found the biggest overlap and the most interesting for us was around orphan wells, right? This big moment where any given, just like a lot of things, any given orphan well may or may not be a really big problem. But when you're talking about millions of them in the US, it really begins to scale and make an impact in ways that we thought we could help with. And so Rebellion Energy Solutions was born. I'm the CEO of that company, and we have successfully sort of transitioned a little bit away from oil and gas, but maybe more into this carbon project developer space. And it's been a journey, but it's been a great one. And we're pretty excited about what's to come in the next year or so too.
How exciting. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about the main activity of Rebellion Energy and sort of how your business model is so innovative and unique?
Sure. So yes, gosh, where to start? So there are a lot of orphan wells in the US, and some of them leak hydrocarbons, methane being the major component from that leak, which is a very potent greenhouse gas and contributes it contribute to climate change. And so our objective is to stop those methane leaks by plugging the well. Plugging the well is something you would do in the oil and gas industry. It's an operation that's kind of built around protecting groundwater, and we have a little bit had to rebuild that around stopping some of those emissions. But in stopping those emissions, abating the methane that would be released into the atmosphere in the future, we do the work to earn a carbon credit for each metric ton of carbon equivalent that is abated. And we use ACR, which is a very reputable carbon registry, to administer those credits and then sell those to folks, industries that are interested in having a neutralized carbon footprint. And are not able to do so completely just in looking at their own internal operations. So they're investing in those types of carbon credits. And so the main kind of the innovative part, right, is taking this oil and gas process that wouldn't typically have been done because there's no longer an owner for these wells, and applying that in a way that previously would have been non-economic, right? Investing money to stop operations is not something you would typically want to do. But in this case, we're able to sort of substantiate that work in a monetary way by administering these carbon credits. And there's a lot more that goes into it beyond just that simple process. But it is it's innovative, and again, it's kind of bringing together two different silos of people and processes and expertise that wouldn't typically be at the same table.
So before you guys, what was the process looking like for orphan wells? What was there any incentive to take care of them, or?
No, so an orphan well, just to sort of set the stage here, is a well that doesn't have a solvent operator or a bonded operator at the state level. And so there's sort of no one, we're not talking about oil and gas companies of today, right? We're talking about past organizations or even individuals that are no longer around and just left these wells with no one to maintain them, look after them. And so those wells have become really, orphan wells is a pretty appropriate term. They've become wards of the state themselves, and the states are typically not well positioned to do the work that needs to be done to remediate these wells, right? That's not a job you would typically think of when you think of a governmental entity. And so the process previously is, you've got this list at the state called an orphan well list, and some states have a budget to do some work on those wells, and some states didn't, and of course, in varying degrees all along the spectrum between those two things. But no state, nor at the federal level, because some of them do exist on under federal jurisdiction and tribal jurisdiction. None of those organizations or agencies really had sufficient funds to accommodate this, again, growing and building scale of orphan wells. And so although you might have seen an orphan well plugged kind of here and there, these orphan well lists continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, year over year over year, until we're left with I think the estimate is like 120, 150,000 orphan wells that we have on these state lists today, and growing, I would say. And then there's this additional problem of all of the undocumented wells, all of these wells that have sort of when whoever walked away from the well, you know, they didn't call up the state and say, hey, we're going to leave this for you, right? They just left. And so there's this lag time in between when a well is actually abandoned and when the well becomes an orphan. And that, I would say, captures, I think estimates are something like 8 times the amount of documented wells. So the answer to your question is nothing was happening really about these orphan wells. And that's a really big contributor to the value of them as a carbon credit, right? When you're talking about carbon credits, one of the pillars that you're anchoring to is this concept of additionality. And so because nothing was happening, nothing was mandated to happen, the resources didn't exist, many multiple other reasons, this work is being done in addition to what would have happened before.
Thank you.
And what does a company like Rebellion Energy do to, find and locate these orphan or idle wells? How do you guys measure the emissions, and what's the process like for plugging and remediating these wells?
Yeah, big triple question there. I'll start at the beginning. So I said states have these orphan wells and lists. And so everybody has access to those lists. And within those lists are some unique identifiers for the wells themselves. And we can use that unique identifier to kind of grab data from other databases that have oil and gas information. Things like where the well is, what kind of construction the well looks like, what's its historic production, things like that. So we have very, very experienced, super critical, highly trained crews out in the field of guys that will go out to these locations once we have access permission from the landowners. And they'll do what we sort of call a sweep, which is basically confirming whether or not a well has a leak, sort of a binary answer, right? Yes or no. If a well has a leak, then it can become a candidate for further work. If a well doesn't have a leak, and most of them don't, frankly, it may have other things that we don't like, but if it doesn't have a leak, then it's not, it doesn't work its way into our process, and we can kind of set it to the side. Once the well has been established to have a leak, we'll go back to the well to measure it and get what's called a baseline emissions measurement. This is sort of the point from which you calculate the volume of credits going forward. And so what you're looking for is a rate of leakage. There's a lot of safety stuff that I'm not going to dive into here because it could take multiple episodes worth of time to cover. But I do think it's really important to say these are really dangerous, and a lot of them have a lot of pressure that in some instances is contained, in some instances is not, or again, in varying degrees. And so, please don't walk out onto a well site and try to, don't do this at home, I guess is what they say. But so our field crews will go out again to a location to try and get a baseline emissions measurement. As you can imagine, we are predicting a future volume of emissions from sort of this single point in time, right? And so there is a very robust process and set of criteria around measuring that rate to make sure it's very stable and very indicative with a high degree of certainty for what the future volume would be. So things like, is it a stable rate? Does it have associated stable pressures, right? Are you touching the well in any other way? Are there any other conditions that might alter what that looks like? All of those things get taken into consideration. So again, under the ACR process, you take one baseline emission measurement. It has to be an eligible measurement. It has to be over a certain amount of time, things like that. And then you stop, pause, wait 30 days, and come back and do another measurement to cover for any variance and just substantiate the first one and make sure everybody's pretty solid on what that well is going to do. So those two baseline emission measurements are sort of averaged together to understand here's the starting point that we're working with when we calculate out 20 years. Once we have that, we can go about the process of plugging the well. There's quite a lot of work to be done in conjunction with whichever jurisdictional body it is to adopt the well. I'll sort of use air quotes because that's not always what it's called, but taking over rights of that well, working with landowners to make sure that they understand what's going on and are comfortable with the process, working with, again, sometimes there might be overlap with tribes, acknowledging that relationship. And then regulatory wise, to get the proper permissions for the proper design of well plugging. Well plugging in its most simplest sense is kind of cleaning out the wellbore itself and then pumping plugs, cement plugs at certain intervals to protect both hydrocarbon bearing zones, water zones, any sort of other erosional or important zones, so that there's not a conduit for things to migrate up or down the wellbore, I suppose, and to surface. We have every state or tribe or fed has a set of requirements for that plugging work. At Rebellion, again, a lot of those requirements were built around protecting groundwater, and methane molecules are really tricky and they can get through a lot of different things. And so we do quite a bit beyond what the regulations require to make sure that our seal is very permanent. Another big pillar of the carbon market. It has to be a permanent solution. And so we sort of do a lot of extra stuff there to make sure, number one, the oversight on location is very, very critical. And are we pumping what we say we're pumping? And what are the additives that we're using in that cement and all of those things, just to make sure that it, again, is a very permanent seal. Once we have plugged the well and done all of the regulatory work to prove that it's been plugged, we also go back and measure the well again, or the non-well again, and confirm that there are no emissions coming from the wellbore itself or anywhere kind of around it within a certain, radius or location, just to make sure that, again, we've done what we said we're going to do. We do a lot of work beyond that to remediate the location, so to get rid of any equipment or other sort of hazardous materials that may have been left out there along with the well. This is very important. And then again, beyond that, we work with the landowners on a land restoration program to make sure that the land is being brought back to a standard that is high, right? We want to make sure that the land is healthy. We want to make sure it's in either its most native state or its most productive state on behalf of the landowners, right? How are these things serving each other? And I think that healthy land component, if you think about 1 million wells out there, there's 1 million, quarter acres of land or whatever that this is addressing. And that's a pretty big deal. So to the extent we can leave it better than we found it, that's something we believe in. And we try to document all of that as well. And make sure that any sort of co-benefit or sustainable development goal at the UN, those types of initiatives are all being quantified as well.
What's the timeline from finding a well, locating it, and in the end, plugging it and making sure that everything is set?
Yeah, good question. And this is one of the coolest things about these projects. If you think about carbon credits, typically you're thinking about a nature-based thing, a forestry, or something like that, and those take a long time to develop and put in place, and the credits to sort of come to fruition. These are much quicker, which means the vintage of our credits is very, very recent, and that's a good thing for people that are interested in purchasing credits. So I would say, we identify a well, put it into our process, do our measurement. I told you there's 30 days. There's probably a 3-month turnaround on the actual operations themselves for these wells. And really, it could be faster, I suppose, but we're kind of grouping them, multiple wells, into a single project. There's probably another 3 months worth of just the administration of the credits themselves here to make sure that all of your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed and everything is what it is supposed to be in order. So, 6 months probably on the project timeline, which means, again, you can have sort of a quarterly project going, and buyers are able to see credits that happen in that year, you know, so there's a very compatible carbon molecule coming in or out of the atmosphere at any given point in time, which I think is, maybe it doesn't actually matter. I don't know that, you know, I don't know that it actually matters, but it feels good, right? It feels a little more tangible when it's closer together.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you.
I'm just curious, how does the legal side of these things kind of look like? Because I imagine a lot of these companies have gone bankrupt or they don't exist anymore. Who do they really hold accountable, if anyone at all?
This, yeah, no one is there to be held accountable. If there's anybody to be held accountable, you know, a lot of times a landowner would have to plug their own orphan well. And this is not cheap. This is, you know, and it could be any range of things, but you know, this is thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? So oftentimes if a landowner wants to get that well plugged, you know, you could maybe like squeaky wheel the state and get it pushed up on the list, but the state doesn't have the resources either. So really that's the main point here, is there is no one to hold accountable for these wells. And the best thing I think we could do sort of as a community of people that cares about this, or a group of stakeholders or whatever, is like, yes, we have these wells that are here now, and yes, we need to find a solution for that. But the really, really scary thing is there are multiple millions of wells that still do have operators that are sort of creating this pipeline, right? And so how do we put policy and things in place so that that pipeline never becomes an orphan well? And honestly, I'll give oil and gas operators a lot of credit here, because for the most part, these are folks that have made it through the ups and downs of oil and gas, right, life cycle. They're doing something right. And for the most part, I've been very impressed with how well they take care of, for the most part, their legacy or older oil and gas wells. And so, you know, you're really talking about, what do we need to do at the state or tribal or federal level, or even with what already exists, to enforce, you know, policy in place or regulation in place so that these wells don't become orphans. That is like another, that is not my specialty. There are other really smart, wonderful people working on that. And I will wish them the best of luck and hope that I can help at some point in the future. But there's sort of two distinct problems here, or a parallel path in the way we approach this, so it doesn't become a problem into the future.
So what are some of the opportunities and challenges of setting up a company like Rebellion Energy? I guess adding on to that, what are some of the exciting parts of it, and how do investors really react to this?
I mean, that's the biggest challenge, right? Finding investors, right, that are going to put money into something that's so new. And you know, this company is not only a new company doing a new thing with a new methodology, it's also a totally new market, right? There's a lot of kind of risky moments or volatile moments, I would say, that you really have to both believe in like the business plan, but you really have to believe kind of in the larger theme too. And so when we were looking for investors, we were talking to folks that we felt like weren't just in it to make a ton of money. They were trying to do the same thing we were, which is marry their fund policy, their business idea with something that has positive impact. And you can typically, in my opinion, kind of tell the bad actors right away. Our investors are a group called Grey Rock Energy Partners. They are investment partners. They have an oil and gas background, so they understood what we were trying to do. But we're in one of their net zero funds. We're in a fund where they have sort of set aside, you know, resources to contribute to something very specific. So I would say, of course, finding money is the hardest thing to do, right? And it's hard even if you're awesome at it, which I'm not. But you know, if you find the right person or the right fit, things begin to work, and that's what we did here. Then the next part of it is sort of working through each of those moments of risk or immaturity or vulnerability or volatility in your business plan, and kind of how do we systematically go through each of those things and mitigate risk or build for it. And for us, there's sort of this three-pronged approach, right? There's the actual business of creating the carbon credits, or the operations of the company, and perfecting those and making it so that this thing just sings. That's, focusing on that as one thing is really important. The second thing for us has been a huge amount of like market education, right? Even this question of what is a carbon credit? What is an orphan well, right? Those are things that a lot of people just aren't familiar with, right? And so really kind of pushing people along in a way that is not about sales, really. It's about education. Has been a challenge, has been, this big sort of prong to what we do on a regular basis. And then I would say the third thing is, again, kind of that risk mitigation. So, identifying points either in our operations or in the market or whatever, where we see those risks, and kind of saying, what can we do in the background to mitigate those things? Because they happen. They just do. Not all of them, not all the time, but some of those things happen. And I would say the thing that we found mitigates the most risk is having the right people doing the right things. And if you want to do oil and gas operations, you have to have oil and gas people doing it. You can't just be a carbon project developer. You have to sort of get over yourself and say, this is what we're going to do. We need the right person to do it. And to us, that's been a critical part of what we've done.
And what about the market sector with, in investing in plugging and remediating abandoned wells? Like, is it growing? And are there any other companies like Rebellion Energy that are trying to attract private investment?
Yeah, good question. There are other companies like us, and I kind of live and breathe this space. So to me, it feels like there's a lot of them, but I don't really know relatively if that's true. There is a handful of other project developers like that sort of say they do a similar thing to us. I would say that there is 3 or less carbon project developers that I respect and think very highly of. There are also a lot of bad actors out there, I think, who are just trying to make a quick buck and aren't thinking about the business or the market in terms of, a longevity. But there are a couple of others out there that I do think are doing a good job and have their own sort of special set of skills. There are a lot of people out there on the sales side, like trying to sell measurement equipment or, all of the little kind of things that you need to make these processes. When there's a lot of that going on, so much so that it is a little bit difficult to sift through some of the weeds there. And there's also kind of some like, again, policy things that are happening too, right? That call attention to it. There are a lot of people trying to get up to speed on what this little micro sector is going to look like, and who that, who are going to be the major players there. I think, there's the approach we've taken is, because we have this expertise, because we have oil and gas experiences, to try to step into a position of thought leadership, right? To try to step into this position of, okay, we know we want this market to be long-term. We know our business needs to be sustainable in and of itself. Here is what we see based on our unique set of experiences that we need to be thinking about in advance. And here's how, even if regulation or frameworks aren't completely caught up with it, here's what we think needs to happen, sort of above and beyond, but not really, because it's just the correct answer. So taking that approach, maybe a proactive approach, has been our strategy. I think it served us well. But we'll see, right? It's like I said, it's growing. It's all kinds of things emerging all the time. And to that extent, I guess the answer to your original question is it's sort of this buzz around it right now. And you're trying to survive that is what it feels like a lot of the times.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it, the buzz around it. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, there's a lot of orphan wells out there in the United States, right? And I was really curious, what part of the challenge do you think can be addressed by companies like yours, driven by these carbon offset markets? And what part of the inventory should really belong to oil producers, and what part for public agencies?
Yeah, well, okay, this might be a controversial answer, but all orphan wells do not have negative impacts on their environment or that, they're remote or whatever. So not all orphan wells are created equal. There are certainly wells that we should prioritize. So I think that the carbon market has the ability to address that subsector of orphan wells. I'm just going to guess, I'm going to say less than 20% of orphan wells are leaking. I think that's probably very fair. That carbon market could address that, right? That's a carbon credit. That makes sense. It's measurable. It's real. It can be a permanent solution. It's additional, all of those things. So there is private financing available to address that. If we really want to sort of maximize our resources, like we got to divvy it out, right? So carbon financing can address that. There is also some federal funding that and some state funding. Again, it's not a lot, but that should probably be dedicated, thinking about it in terms of this as taxpayer dollars for those resources. In my opinion, my humble opinion, we should be addressing the wells that are proximal to populations, right? That are directly impacting the people whose taxpayer dollars are going to the remediation of it. And so I think, I don't know the percentage of wells that is sort of very near public spaces and places and things like that. But certainly it's some percentage out there, and that's where I think those funds should go. That's my opinion. I'm going to get in trouble for saying that later. I think that the other there's like some philanthropic dollars that I think will have their own, particular impact they want to address. And then the big sort of elephant in the room is that leaves a lot more orphan wells out there that aren't leaking, but do likely have some kind of impact on their surroundings, right? And there is not like a clear person or group that I think should be responsible for those. So the inverse of your question is, what should oil and gas companies that exist today that did not create this problem, but they exist today and they have this expertise, what should they be responsible for? And, again, I'm kind of going to push that over to this parallel path problem that is, do not let any more wells become orphans, right? We have so many wells out there with operators who are very well positioned to manage those wells, and they need to do that. And policy and regulation needs to be in place to ensure that happens. And I don't think a single oil and gas operator out there, maybe not a single, I don't think most of the oil and gas companies out there would disagree with that at all. But it does leave a big chunk of things unaddressed, right? Luckily, that big chunk of things is the things that have the least amount of impact, probably. And so I guess that's how I would go about, prioritizing things. Now, the one other thing I think oil and gas companies can contribute to this particular issue, because it's fitting for them in my mind, is to the extent those oil and gas companies have net zero goals, right? If they are interested in offsetting their footprint, the ability that they have to offset their footprint with something that they are really savvy themselves at and can do diligence in a really positive way. To me, there's a win-win there, right? They're offsetting their footprint, but they're also bolstering the integrity of these credits within the market because they're able to kind of contribute to the knowledge about how this should be done in a really positive way.
Do you think the carbon offsets are enough of a driving force, like economically, to get rid of like the problematic wells?
Yes, I do. I think that so let's say 20, so there's, I'm going to change my answer on you. I'm going to try and put it in like units so it's a little bit easier to understand or easier for me to work through at least. So if there's orphan wells, and then some of those orphan wells are leaking, and then some of those wells are leaking in quantities that are economic for a carbon project, right? Like the math there is, it has to be leaking enough so that the value of the carbon credits is more than the cost it is to plug the well, right? So that's a subset of wells. Then there's even another subset of wells that is, some of these wells are orphans, are leaking in quantities big enough to substantiate them being in a project, but they also have to be quantifiable. That volume has to be quantifiable. And not all wells that are leaking in substantial amounts are leaking in steady, predictable ways that make the volume of credits that should be associated with them really easy to quantify, right? And so again, we're talking about a methodology at ACR at least that has this very strict criteria for the measurements to be eligible. And some wells just aren't going to behave in that consistent way. And so they might not be eligible. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be plugged. And I think as methodologies develop and become more are able to become more complex, right? Right now we have to do kind of a concise thing because the market's still trying to understand this, right? And it's a hard thing to understand. But I do think that will expand as the methodologies are able to shift and grow, and hopefully they'll grow in ways that capture more methane abatement opportunities and not less. And that's a big part of the market right now, right? Is making sure that you have a commercial product, right? The only way to be 100% certain about a 20-year leak is to measure it for 20 years. But if you do that, you didn't plug the well, you didn't abate anything. So, we're dealing with this push and pull of how can we be most accurate, and where we're not accurate, err on the side of conservatism, but still plug the well, right? Still do the thing. So, again, I used a lot of words to answer your question. There is this like sliver of wells, I think, that is leaking and won't be able to be, and right now won't be able to be turned into a carbon credit. But I hope that gets smaller and smaller and smaller into the future, as like a little sub industry kind of grow and get a little more intricate with the way we're building out these frameworks.
Awesome. So that's more on like the ACR side then, right?
Well, no, not necessarily. Yes, it's the ACR side because they own the framework or the methodology, but they also can't put out a methodology that the market doesn't understand, right? So there's this sort of fulsome education process up and down this value chain that has to have. They also can't put out a methodology that we don't have the technology to accommodate, or that carbon project developers can't do yet. It's not commercial for them. So those will, again, those things will all move and shift and change. And so what ACR's job is right now is to put out a methodology that is both commercial and accurate / conservative, given the current set of circumstances. And that's what they've done. What that means is it doesn't capture every well, but again, that's the goal. That's where we will get to. And as things develop, as technology and learnings grow, they will be able to update their methodology, and they will be able to add things in there that capture more and more and more of those wells.
Wow, yeah, that's the future is very bright in this subsector.
It is.
Staci, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real honor to have you on the podcast. But before we leave, is there anything that we forgot to ask you that you think is important to share with our audience?
Great question. Let me think for like 10 seconds about that. Important to share with the audience. Well, I think maybe the most important thing, I don't maybe know enough about who your audience is, but the most important thing I think I'll say is that these wells exist all over the country. And whether or not it's leaking methane, it may be dangerous. And so if you know of an orphan well, or if you know of a well that might be an orphan, like, number one, please don't go do anything with it. But number two, let the state know, right? Because that's the only way it's ever going to get taken care of. And there's this constant need for more information out there. So, I mean, at the very core of what we do, it sort of bothers me that we have this problem at all, right? Like I told you, I started off, this will be full circle. I started off with, I have 2 kids. I have 2 little girls. And the number one lesson every parent tries to teach their child is to pick up your stuff before you go do something else, right? And as a society, as an industry, as a group of consumers, we haven't done that. And it just sort of like is irritating that that's the case. So, it is, I think, a little bit of a group effort here. And so, closing remarks, like if you see something like that, let us know so we can fix it. And let's, as a society, not continue to create that situation for ourselves into the future.
Just a quick question. Sorry, I know we're ending, but how many orphan wells do you think are not reported? Just to add more magnitude to it.
So the number I think that the states would tell you, I think IOGCC did a survey of states what they think it is. It was 8 times the amount of documented ones. So I think that's 8 times 120, 960,000 orphan wells. So let's call it 1 million orphan wells that we don't know about. Yeah, scary.
It's a scary number.
Yeah, it's a big number. And thank you guys both as well. The very good questions, cool stuff to talk about. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Formed Rebellion Energy Solutions, from the convergence of oil and gas industry, as we heard in this episode, experience and the environmental stewardess has a focus on orphan wells.
Plugging orphan wells for methane leaks meant they had to change a little of the traditional thinking about plugging a well to protect our water resources.
And Rebellion does this plugging of the orphan wells for carbon offset credits on the carbon market.
Carbon credits deal with the idea of additionality. For orphan wells, without the activity of a company like Rebellion or others, no one would be plugging these wells to mitigate their environmental impact.
Don't do this at home, is what was mentioned. Plugging an oil and gas well involves a lot of possible safety issues, so you need to train a crew and follow the proven methodology.
Well plugging involves cleaning out the well, placing a mechanical cement plug to protect groundwater zones, and then extra work to place barriers or a permanent solution to prevent methane or greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. Plus, taking away any surface facility and work with the landowners to bring the site back to a natural state.
Probably it takes about 3 to 6 months for an orphan well project to be in place, which is much quicker than other nature-based carbon mitigation projects.
It could take 10 to hundreds of thousands of dollars to plug an abandoned well, though.
But there are two distinct problems. Getting current operators to take care of their current wells, and second, to also deal with the current abandoned well inventory and to not let any more wells become orphan.
The biggest challenge in all of this is to find investors who believe and understand in this new business model, Staci said.
Not all orphan wells are the same, as we heard, but maybe only 20% produce enough methane emissions to qualify for a carbon market.
Measurement of emissions has to be quantifiable, help the market understand the opportunity, and build trust.
What is the cost of going green? Actually, no one really knows for sure, and it depends on the scope of the transition. But a recent study by the consultancy McKinsey and Company said this. We found that if you look at those energy systems today, we are spending about 5.7 trillion annually on both high emission spending and some low emission spending. Under a transition scenario, over the next 3 decades, that 5.7 trillion would need to rise to 9.2 trillion. Also, about 75% of that 5.7 trillion is going to high emission spending. Going forward, 75% would need to go towards low emission spending. So it's not just a scale up of capital, it's a reallocation of capital. The finance system is integrating net zero with new financing commitments and mechanisms, but a 41 trillion funding gap remains. Our guest today, Brad Handler, head of the Energy Finance Lab at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines, will join us. Brad was with us in season 1, and he is back to help us unravel the mysteries of the carbon offset trading market as a potential source for private funding for emission reductions in the energy transition.
Sure. Well, if I go, I guess, more chronologically, about 25 years ago, I started with investment banks as an equity research analyst. And a little bit of happenstance and a little bit of background led me to the oil and gas sector, and specifically the oilfield services sector within that. And I did that happily for about 20 years, covering when you're a sell-side research analyst, you focus on providing buy and sell recommendations for publicly traded equities. And then I was specifically looking at the oilfield services sector. And that when that ran its course, and I decided to try to step into the policy world, one thing or one introduction led to another, and I found myself at the Payne Institute. And we slowly put together this idea of creating, as Jim described it, it's called the Energy Finance Lab, with the express intent to try to nurture financial mechanisms and financial understanding to help with decarbonization efforts that relate to skills that are very pronounced at the Colorado School of Mines, which really means that we focus on things in the subsurface. So it's oil and gas related, it's CCS, carbon capture and storage related, looking at geothermal, and doing a lot now with critical mineral development as well. The idea that, well, governments only have so much money or can only raise so much money, but you have to kind of activate the levers of capitalism if you really want to achieve that much more activity, that much more change in this case, and just to sort of make it durable. And so one way of answering your question is that we look at a couple of different financing mechanisms or bodies. Carbon markets is an important one, and I know we're going to talk about that a lot today. And then we look at sort of how do certain activities that are related to climate mitigation raise funding through markets. And I can hopefully take my own experience in equity and commodity markets and translate that to what do the carbon markets have to evolve to be to make that somewhat more effective. So that's one sort of cross-cutting example. We've also looked at tax policies, looked at potential financial mechanisms that might support the demand side of equations. So here I can amplify on that a little bit. If in the Biden administration, there were a number of policies passed around creating tax incentives for the supply side of things, as in to invest money to build capacity in whether it's renewable energy or to some degree, even with mining and processing. There are other ways of approaching this as well. So there are demand support mechanisms. And so we look at some of those kinds of things, which again, can be tax related. They might not be tax related, but look at those as well. And then we look specifically at commodity market development as well to think about things like green premia. Would someone be willing to pay more for a mineral that was mined in a so-called sustainable way versus one that was mined in a less sustainable way, and thinking about what it might take to develop incentives or to what incentives it might take to actually get markets like that to evolve.
Thank you so much for joining us for the future of energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abhi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.